All bright and early. Um, and what I can promise you is what we have here is a very interesting session and an unusual one for COP because what we have here together with us today is an entire panel of national lawmakers, and we're very excited to be joined as well by our very own Dr. Musonda Mumba, who is the Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention. And what we'd like to do is to bring this panel of high-level parliamentarians together from around the world to actually talk about the challenges, not just of the challenges of land restoration, but also how can legislation help and how can parliamentarians be the driving force or the change makers behind the change we'd like to see for land. So that's the idea of today's session. We have just under 90 minutes. I think we're running a little late. So I can see we have 80 minutes now. And what we'll try and do is have as interactive a session as possible with lots of questions. I've got a few. I'm sure you will have some. Feel free. We will have a space for you to be able to ask them as well. My name is Sandhya. I am from the United Nations System Staff College. We're an organization looking at learning and training within the UN system. We're based in Bonn. And I'm going to be here to moderate this session for you. So without further ado, I'm very excited to actually introduce you to our fantastic panel today. And I'm going to start with Dr. Musonda Mumba, who is right here on my right. I'm very bad with my lefts and rights, so I'm not sure. I always have to look at my hand to figure out. Okay. Dr. Mumba is a Zambian environmentalist, and she's worked for 25 years in the spaces of environment and climate change. She's worked with the UNDP, she's worked with UNEP, she is now the Secretary General, as I said, of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. She has also, and this something that's very close to my heart, she has actually founded the network of African women environmentalists and strengthened the hands of women in STEM. So Dr. Mumba, very wonderful to have you with us again. Thank you so much for joining us. And with Dr. Mumba is a fantastic panel. And we have four wonderful parliamentarians from different parts of the world. I'm going to begin with Honorable Rosa Galvez. And Senator Rosa Galvez is independent senator in the Senate of Canada. And she chairs and is on the several standing committees on energy, environment, natural resources, but also interestingly, also a member of the Standing Committee on National Finance. And I think that's a very interesting link, and we're definitely going to come back to you, Rosa, on questions around the links between the two. But she's also chairs the climate change arm of the Parliamentary Network of Parliamentarians, and therefore very excited to have you here as the president of Parliamentarians. Thank you. And we come next to Honorable Beatrice Ogola from Kenya. And Honorable Beatrice is distinguished senator in the 3rd Senate of Kenya. She is an active member on several standing committees, land, environment, tourism, wildlife, forestry, and natural resources, but also on information and communication and technology. And so that's again, a very interesting combination of things to have. She is also the parliamentary champion for the SDGs. And so I'm really going to bring that sort of systemic approach from you. In addition to a bunch of other things, we know that she is also a huge champion for gender rights and for inclusion within Kenya. And we have found out yesterday that Beatrice is also a very enthusiastic cook and family member. Beatrice, welcome to this panel. I move next to Honorable Jacqueline Monjin from Uganda. And Honorable Jacqueline started off as one of the youngest senators. I think she began her career in Parliament at the age of 24. Is that right? That's incredible. She is on a number of standing committees within the parliament in Uganda, but also interestingly is on the East African Legislative Assembly and chairs the the East African Committee on Climate Change, Environment, and Conservation. And so, very excited to have you here with us, Jacqueline, and to bring this perspective not just of Uganda but also of the region that you represent. And finally, last but not least, we have Honorable Anthony Vieira from Trinidad and Tobago. And Honorable Anthony Vieira is an independent senator in the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago. He has been picked, I think this is his third term, having won the trust of 3 different presidents in over this period. He works in he's originally actually trained as an intellectual property lawyer, and therefore is very interested in the spaces of intellectual property, telecommunications, environmental and commercial law. And in addition to the work that he does within Trinidad and Tobago, he also serves as the vice president in the Parliamentarians network. And so delighted to have you here, Anthony, to join this panel of women. Very excited to have you all here. Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to start off, and I'm wondering if I can actually move this podium just a little bit so we can all sit down and have a conversation. Yes, thank you. Okay, as I said, we're going to make this as conversational as possible. So I'm going to start off, just throw a few questions at you, and we can then begin the conversation there. Okay, and I'm going to start with you, actually, Dr. Mumba, and ask you, you've been in this space for the past 25 years. You have worked on a number of different areas within climate change and environment, and have been focused recently on wetlands. And you're here at COP16. I would really like to ask you to sort of lay out the ground for us on why this is such an urgent issue today.
No, thank you very much. I'm deeply honored to be here in such, wonderful company and amazing individuals. Firstly, I want to begin with my heritage. I was born in northern Zambia, close to the border with Congo DRC. And in my hometown, when I was a teenager, my father was the mayor of my hometown. And I remember, because I grew up literally about 100 meters away from the Mansa River, beautiful river system. And when I go back today, I take my children back to my hometown. My father died recently. I go back to my hometown and parts of the river doesn't flow. And I ask myself, what happened here? Something happened because this is where I grew up. This is where I was born. This is my hometown. And something changed. And that something is that there's some degradation somewhere in the upper catchment, that the flow of the river has changed. Not just the flow, but the color of the river. It's more red because there's a lot of sediment or there's something happening. Fast forward many years later, I trained as a wetland ecologist and hydrologist in Zambia, and I did my PhD on a big river basin, on a big wetland system, where I have seen the assault of climate change happen fast and furious. For those that may not be aware, Zambia right now and most of Southern Africa is in the middle of the worst drought in the last 20 years, the worst. In my country, there's 22 hours of blackouts. Why? Because we depend on hydroelectricity. And there is not enough water in the rivers, and we begin to see how the degradation of landscapes, etc., happen. Now, when it comes to the legislation element, and that's why I'm so excited to be in this company, because with the urgency of change comes the legislators. They're sitting in parliament, they're thinking, oh, something has happened here. What do we do? What laws do we change? What do we put in effect urgently to be able to deal with this crisis at hand? And I'll be very curious to hear how they're dealing with this crisis, because most of these crises are manifesting in wetlands. We can talk about Kenya and Uganda. They share a lake system, the Lake Victoria. We've seen what the assault of invasive species has done to that lake system. Drop in water levels has done to that system. In Canada, we've seen those fires in Canada because the peatlands are drier. and happening in Trinidad and Tobago. We've seen how even the advancement of the tourism industry is changing the landscape in the wetland areas and the coastal areas. And then the assault of invasive species like sargassum. So for me, the thread of complexity is happening everywhere. It's happening everywhere. And how do we find solutions for that through mechanisms that exist in the countries, not just at the sovereign state, but also at the transboundary level? Because what happens in Canada, where the fires are happening, does not stay in Canada. That smoke is going across to the US and furthermore. And it's been interesting to watch because it was like, whoa, okay, what's happening here? It's tragic, and that is a developed country.
Thank you. And I think you make a really good point on the manifestation of this. I think it's becoming much clearer and much stronger. And certainly there are regions where it is definitely more visible. I'm actually going to go to you, Anthony, and ask you to talk about how you see it from the perspective of a small island developing state. What are the impacts that you're seeing on the ground?
All right. Well, thank you. And I want to start off by saying here we all appreciate the urgency, but I don't know if that urgency has percolated to the decision makers. Governments seem to me to be sleeping. Their eyes are open, but they're sleeping. And in 2025, we're going to have a very different world. That's not a long time away. In the Caribbean, we stand to lose islands, right? Our food security is going to be impacted. I think we have to be talking seriously about migration because populations are going to have to move. We're going to have to look at redeveloping our whole infrastructure system. So this is a very serious matter. But this topic about law and land degradation assumes that you have an enlightened parliament and you have an enlightened legislature and government. It assumes that law for land degradation is a priority. That is not necessarily the case. So I'll come back. I'll come back to that later, but those are just my starting thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. I'm actually going to move to you, Jacqueline, and ask you again from the East African perspective and looking at it as a region, are you seeing these impacts being felt more strongly, but are you seeing that political awareness of these issues is rising?
Okay, thank you so much, Sandia. And I would like to really thank all my colleagues who are already in this panel. From the Ugandan perspective and the East African region perspective, first of all, as you realize that 41% of our lands are degraded worldwide, and then in Uganda, 65%. East Africa generally, that's all the 9 federating countries, that's 70% of the land degraded. And therefore, like Honorable Vieira said, we cannot just sleep and watch. I want to be on the positive note that there is a lot of awareness raising going on land restoration initiatives that are being put in place both at the regional level and also at the national levels. But it's very important to know that as change makers, I participated in the GCAP. I was among the first cohorts in the parliamentarians for change makers. And to me, on my own perspective, I've stopped blaming government because eventually all of us parliamentarians are part of government and we have to take action. So what I have decided on my own as a member of parliament who has been championing climate action in the continent, but also particularly who participated in the GCAP, I have brought in parliament, first of all in the parliament of Uganda, we have come up with a land restoration forum, but also at the regional level, I have come up with bills. I have 3 bills right now in the offing, and if these bills are the restorations bill at the regional level, if these bills are passed and assented to by the council, by the summit of heads of states of the East African countries, then these bills will be automated in the national assemblies for implementation. So, meaning that all of us must take action. I have also another bill on single-use plastics, because all these issues that we are ending single-use plastics are very imperative in our day-to-day implementation of our activities. There are bills that I have also tried to bring at the regional, but I remember in Uganda, I sponsored a bill on climate change, which was eventually enacted as an act of of Uganda's parliament. Now at the regional level, I have also brought a bill. Hopefully it will pass, because I'm galvanizing support from the different stakeholders to support this bill, so that issues of restoration, if we're talking about climate change, cannot be left behind. So it's about taking action, and all of us taking action. At the regional level, we are trying our best. And there are many other acts that are being passed in the different parliaments in the East African region, including the National Forestry and Tree Planting Act in Uganda, in Kenya, in Rwanda, in Burundi, in Somalia, I would say all the 9 member countries. So initiatives are there. In Uganda, we are saying the Tree Planting Act, by 2030, we should have at least 2.5 2.5 billion trees planted in those areas that are drylands, and efforts are ongoing. So different initiatives are there, but I think that the aggressiveness, like Honorable Vieira said, is still very limited. We need to hype this, and that's the role for all of us, legislators, civil society organizations, and all the other stakeholders, because this is for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So, Beatrice, I'm going to come to you as the SDG champion and somebody who sees these systemic interlinkages. Talk to me a little about the importance of looking at it as a bigger picture thing. I mean, I remember just now Jacqueline mentioned the plastics ban, right? How does it work to run programs like this when you consider transboundary effects?
Thank you so much. Before I even come to looking at how it works, we must begin by appreciating the fact that the impact is massive. If she talked about, Dr. talked about the rivers drying. I remember growing up and there were streams all over in the communities. And I can tell you the streams are dry as we hear, partly because of human activity and partly because of the growing populations. And I can tell you that our people lack water, and especially in countries where access to water is inadequate. But then, even when you have water source somewhere, reticulation access to the people is negligible. So climate change and its effects are real in our countries. I can tell you that our people have no access to adequate water. But looking at the impact of climate change, recently in Kenya, we were confounded with massive floods. And that is an aspect of climate change. Because of the massive floods, we had loss of lives, lot of life were lost. In one village or community, we just woke up to floods had wiped out homes and wiped out members of families. And that tells you how grave the situation is. And as I've told you before, that once we move out of the floods, then we are faced with severe drought. And with the drought, it means our people lack basics, they lack water, they lack food, and then our people have to move in search of these basics. A number of our communities are still, like in the northeastern Kenya, we have people who keep a lot of cattle still, and they have to move from place to place looking for pasture and looking for water. In the process of that movement, conflicts arise from communities to communities, and so with the climate change, we have lack of food, we have lack of water, our children break from school because they have to move from region in search of these basics. And then the issue of insecurity comes. So I can tell you the impact is more than we can say. And just to call out on the world and everybody that attention must be given to the issues of climate change because it's leading to destabilizing our livelihoods. And that brings me to also the idea of the massive degradation of our lands. 80% of my country, you have degraded land. And so what are we doing as parliamentarians? Just to answer your question, a lot of initiatives are coming in. One, it is important to notice, to take note that Parliament sets priorities, particularly in my country, because Parliament allocates resources, and resources are key to land restoration. Other than the legislative work that we do, we allocate resources that finally is used into the restoration programs. If you call it afforestation, maybe to take care of the deforested areas, you need resources to work towards that. You need to sensitize our people to take care of the natural resource that is land. But again, as Parliament, we have to develop the required legal frameworks to address that. Thank you.
Um, Thank you, Beatrice. And you sort of really paint this picture of the impact of climate change. You also talk about its links to climate security, migration, climate induced migration, and so on. And it's often a debate whether these impacts, which are so strongly felt in, what could be called termed the global south, in the countries that you're coming from, are not as strongly felt in the more affluent countries, and that may be causing some of the lack of action. So, Rosa, turning to you as someone from Canada, do you see these impacts as well? Does your country recognize them? And in what ways does it impact lives and livelihoods in Canada?
Good morning. First, thank you for the kind invitation to be surrounded by such incredible people trying to change what is happening. Of course, in Canada, we are very much feeling the impacts of global warming because Canada, in average, is warming up 2 times faster, but our Arctic is warming up 5 to 7 times faster. So we have been seeing struggles with extreme weather events since the 90s. And the recent ones are the atmospheric rivers that causes incredible floods, destroys arable land, agricultural land, but also the forest fires, which are creating geopolitical frictions with our neighbors. But also they are also creating a very high cost in health because now the increase in asthma, respiratory, allergic symptoms have increased incredible. And these floods, mega floods, are destroying basic infrastructure. So yes, what we have to recognize, and I agree with many of the things that my colleagues have said, that the science is ahead. We've been known about this for the last 40, 50 years. Actually, as an engineer, as a professor, I've been teaching my engineer students for the last 20 years that we were in a transition. We were telling them and showing them how to design electricity using renewable energy, biomass, solar panels, wind. But the legislation is so behind that we still being in a G7 country, we don't have this. So we have to rely on private, high-risk front corporations that decide that they are going to bet on renewable energy, while the government is still giving massive subsidies in the 20s and 30s of billions of dollars per year to the oil and gas industry. So how can compete renewable energy with a heavily subsidized industry? Now, I think that in Parliament, we are raising awareness. In particularly in my case, I'm trying to explain to my colleagues that these crises are interlinked and they are based on the issue of pollution, whether it is plastic, whether it is waste, whether it is emissions, and that they are polluting our air, our soil, and our water, and then difficulting the the stability of not the region but the planet, and that we are approaching tipping points, important tipping points that may get to irreversible situations that will bring not only the issues related with safety and security in the environment, but health, social unrest, security, because of the massive migrations that we have heard. So I also try to put emphasis on the links with the economic model and the finance system, because without the finance sector being implicated in this ecological transition and energy transition, nothing will be possible. The technologies exist. You know, I've been studying sargassum and so many ways of recycling sargassum as nutrients, as so many, but there is no finance for this. And so we really have to convince first the public finance sector and then the private finance sector that investing in nature, in land restoration, in attenuation, it is profitable. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosa. I think you bring up a really interesting question around finance. But before we go there, I heard all of you say that there is awareness, that there is a clear impact within your countries, that there is awareness that there is a clear impact, that there is, that it's being felt in terms of lives lost, in terms of livelihoods lost. So, Musonda, you have been, speaking in this space for a long time. Do you feel that the political awareness is changing? Is it enough? What is stopping us from getting the momentum around this topic?
I think it is. It is changing because you're being forced to. You're being forced to change. I'll give you a very classic example. In 2021, actually 2020, when COVID happened, I was in Kenya. The same month, March, if you remember, the world locked down. Not only did the world lock down, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda was flooding because we had this Eastern dipole. So the leaders were forced to deal not only with a health pandemic crisis, they were forced to deal with a climatic crisis, because not only were people being, people were being told, oh, you have to, what was the word that we were told? Is it isolate or separate? How do you isolate in the middle of a flood? So there was so much confusion in terms of what decision-making mechanism should happen in the midst of a flood and a pandemic. And as you've rightly said, the polycrisis forced us to do something. So what I've seen personally is that, and I'll give a couple of examples, and I'm so glad that Her Excellency from Uganda is here. His Excellency, the President Museveni, he has seen that the degradation of wetlands is causing such severe problems. Not only is infrastructure getting washed, when the African Development Bank has invested so much in bridges, roads, etc., the destruction of a wetland results in a river getting washed. I was in Uganda last May, and I just arrived when the bridge had been washed, the bridge that connects Masaka to Kampala. What did that mean? That meant that food to Kampala could not be supplied, and the price of food just spiked because the bridge was gone. So legislators are being forced to do something. Let me go to South America. In Chile, I met a senator there, Senator Uresti. He even visited us in Switzerland at our convention. Senator Uresti has been impressive because, like yourselves, he's gone to the legislative and said, if the majority of the world's population, including the population of Chile, is going to be in cities, what do we do about wetlands in cities? He went to Parliament and said to the Senate and said, we need a decision to have a bill on urban wetlands, because urban wetlands are disappearing, and also because cities are warming much faster And because they're warming much faster, you need all these green spaces and enclaves to actually cool the city. I want to touch a little bit on your story on Sargassum. I was in Belize last year. I'd never seen Sargassum because I come from a landlocked country in Zambia. And colleagues, I mean, this weed is perverse and it goes all over the Caribbean and it smells like rotten eggs. But the solution to sargassum is an innovative technological solution. So you begin to see the interconnectedness of our solutions, because even when a bill is passed, what does it mean for a private sector or someone in the tech world to actually find a solution to this perverse environmental problem? And this is something that I need to challenge. And maybe it would be good to also hear from the legislators whether this is something they're challenging and championing in the tech world or in the technological world. Please find a solution for this matter, because it's not just hiring 10,000 people like we did with the water hyacinth, pull it out. No, this requires mechanics.
It's not sustainable.
It isn't. It isn't. And sometimes we try and ask women, yeah, women, go and resolve this. We've seen it in the Sahel. You go and stand in 35 or to 40-degree heat? No. Get the machines in there, or get some technological drone technology for all I care, because the solutions, we have them.
May I make a response? And also to put something in perspective. So you are right. Sometimes we are forced to respond to climate change. But that's the problem. We are reacting. We need to be proactive. What's happening is that our governments are working within election cycles. Their priorities are governed by little things, not the existential things. You need to light a fire under their seats. You need to understand that parliaments are critical if we are going to solve this crisis, right? And you need to lobby your parliamentarians. So to put it in context, let me tell you what the parliaments do, because we have to look at this from the perspective of rule of law, right? We need a combination of strategic planning, stakeholder engagement, financial mechanisms, and monitoring frameworks. That's not going to happen by chance. Legislation can drive effective land restoration. You need strong legal frameworks. They are essential to ensure global commitments to land restoration are met. They are what will drive sustainable practice, and they will reverse land degradation. Legislation can assist communities in participating in effective land restoration. So you get the framework for stakeholder engagement, which is very important. Legislation can designate degraded lands for restoration while regulating unsustainable land use practices. Someone was talking from Argentina about saving the ecosystems. Well, you can designate protected species. We need to legislate for research and development. Not enough is happening. We need to provide, yesterday there was a chapter there, we were talking about the difficulties in getting support for these innovative techniques. Well, the parliaments can help with public-private partnerships. We can help eco-entrepreneurs by offering opportunities like tax relief, incentives for their innovations. We need to legislate regulatory support, financial support, advocating budgets, allocating budgets. The parliaments monitor. We play a very important oversight role. So monitoring mining companies and all of these corporations. So policy integration, embed land restoration into broader national priorities, food security, the Sendai framework. So when you have damaged infrastructure, you don't just repair it, but you repair it better. You build to be resilient and sustainable. Biodiversity and conservation. So I don't think we are doing enough at the parliamentary level, and I am hoping that the takeaway here today is that you will engage your parliaments. You will really make them work and do what they're supposed to do. Because once you get that going, that's the key, I think, to moving forward.
I wanted to just add on to what Antonio said, that it is not enough that Parliament enacts laws, because I do not think it is for lack of laws. But I think we need to, after getting the laws, we need to have regulations that makes the laws operational. For example, in my country, we have the Physical Planning Act. It is available. We are talking about the riparian, and our people are moving to the riparian and causing a lot of degradation of those areas. What are we doing as parliamentarians? After the laws, do we have regulations that make the laws operational? Or is it just after we need to make laws after laws? I think the laws are there. But other than the regulations, as he says, we need to have our people, we need to enhance community engagement, as he says. Let our people be in the mood that we can do it. We need to be aware of the dangers of degradation, so that we need to work, all of us, towards restoring our lands. So I was just building up to the point that we do not only need laws, but we need regulations that make them operational. And lastly, we also need to work on enforcement of these laws. In most of our countries, the laws are there, the regulations are there, but are they enforceable? Who is following up? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Rosa, I saw you wanted to come in, but I also wanted to bring you in on the question of finance. So please go ahead.
Yes. So first, just to complete, is that there is a lot of laws that exist, but there is a lot of laws that are all age. And in the area of climate change, biodiversity laws, we need to renew, modernize these bills. So in Canada, for example, it took 23 years to modernize the Impact Assessment Act. That shouldn't be, because now we know about cumulative impacts, we know about indirect impacts, and also another issue with laws is sometimes they are the result of a heavy corporative industrial lobby. And I think that together with the laws that protects lands, protects the environment, we have to have very strong laws that regulates lobbying, because otherwise laws are done for the interest of invested interest. And so we have to correct that. Another thing is that we are trying to do in Canada is that in every single law that we pass, we add a clause that says that it has to be reviewed every 3 years by Parliament with respect to the objectives that they were said at the beginning of the law. So if we, for example, have a bill that says we have to protect 20%, 30% of our land by 2030, well, we have to have bills that look into, did we attain that goal or we didn't attain that goal? Also, with respect to the finance, is that we need that the finance sector aligns with the nature and climate commitments. Otherwise, we will never get to realize these transitions that we so much need. And if you realize in your own countries, if you take a look in your own countries, you will see that your own banks, your own pension plans, your own finance sectors as insurers or mutual funds, they keep investing in something that causes damage to the environment, causes damage to the land, increases emissions of gas emissions or industrial emissions, and they keep investing in that. And there is no enough money, funds, for innovation, for research and development, nature-based solution, and scaling up all these beautiful technology that is there existing, but cannot find enough funds to be upscale. And so there must be some type of laws that tell the finance sector that they can do not harm to the environment, or that they have to help the sectors attaining our international commitments. Like, for example, we have one, we are signatories of the Paris Agreement, and we say that we shouldn't exceed 1.5 degrees. So we should go back and say, in order not to exceed 1.5 degrees, this is the maximum emissions I can put in there and reduce. And so therefore, per sector, we need to have transition plans. And these transition plans needs to be science-based. And the finance sector needs to be aligned with this through regulation. Because if I ask a question, did ever the financial sector or the free market redress itself to solve a problem? The answer is no. You have so many examples in which the free market and the financial sector didn't redress. You have the opioid crisis, you have the 2008 crisis, we have numerous crises, and they didn't redress themselves. So they need help from regulators to redress themselves. Thank you.
Jacqueline, did you want to come?
Okay, so most of my colleagues have talked about the regulatory frameworks, the legislative frameworks in place. To me, I would say that let each of us play their role. The legislators must play their role. All the other actors should play their role. For example, I would say that some of the laws could be archaic in a country. There are so many laws that have been passed by parliaments. They are acts of parliament. They are archaic. They are redundant. They do not act to the new times that we are in now. So revamping such laws is very important. For example, I want to give an example of Kenya. Kenya was the first country in Africa to come up with a climate change bill, which was enacted in 2015, and then followed by Uganda, of course. And of course, today, out of the 55 countries, we have only 8 countries that have come up and enacted a bill on a law on climate change. And yet we are grasping with the climate change issue in the whole world. So it means that Africa as a continent has to hype its mandate, its legislative agenda, because once you have an act in place, it means that even prioritization of government policies and business will come because there's already a law in place. So Kenya last year, 2022, yes, 2022 revamped its climate change act to have the carbon market act. Today, the whole world is talking about carbon markets and carbon trading. But you know, this cannot just be a talk. There must be a regulation in a member country whereby this trading is regulated. It cannot just be free entry and exit. So most of these legislations that are in place, some of which may need to be revamped to fit into our day-to-day modus operandi. But most important, as legislators, we are only not legislators. We are also lobbyists. We are also representatives of the people. And we also do oversight. So you find that most of these legislations may be passed, but the implementation remains archaic. So that's an area that we have to re-emphasize. As lobbyists, today I would say Africa is emitting less than 4% to emissions. When we went to COP29 in Baku, we were like, no, scientific evidence shows that we need 1.3 trillion US dollars by 2030 towards adaptation, resilience, restoration, and all those programs. But eventually, from 100 billion to 300 billion. But for me, who has been following in every parliament, I try to look at what vote goes to climate-related engagements. Little money comes to these member countries in terms of engagement. Even the procedure of getting this money is tedious. So last month we resolved to have 300 billion, right, US dollars. But the modalities on who benefits, Who contributes? Does it come as concessional loans or does it come as a grant? Is not clear. So you find that most of the countries in Africa are haggling with the debt payments. Even when they are able to prioritize restoration and all that, there are a lot of demands in terms of paying the debts. And yet, really, it is 3.6 to be exact, that is emitted from the rest of the 55 countries. Even if we offsetted the 3.6, we will still be heavily affected. So for us as legislators, I think we are pushing for affirmative action, because there are those countries, not only in Africa, that are vulnerable, most vulnerable to climate change, but initiatives towards financing and access to this financing is quite tedious and unrealizable. Now, as I conclude, Madam Sadia, we in Africa, I did a study out of the 55 countries. Only 6 are able to freely access the bureaucracy. That is Kenya, Senegal, a little bit of South Africa, a little bit of so it's so when we're talking about financing should trickle down to solve local initiatives. If it remains at the international level, then we are not addressing any issue. We are meant to act local but impact globally. I think that's what I would contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hand to Musonda now, actually, and come to you because I think this question always comes back. This question of finance. How do we get finance to these spaces that need them? And how do we influence that? I just want your perspective on it. In the negotiations that you've been having, what has been successful in our being able to direct the international financial architecture towards the right goals?
No, thank you. I think what's been successful is that there's a demonstration of the evidence of change in many spaces. I'll give an example of Kazakhstan. A few days ago, we had the One Water Summit with President Macron of France, together with President Tomayev of Kazakhstan. Now, you all have seen that picture of the Aral Sea. We have in our lifetime lost ecosystems disappearing, and there's a boat that's stranded in the middle of this landscape. I was in Uzbekistan a few months ago, and it's an assault on your senses because it's so dry. And not only is it so dry, the land is so dry, there's only salt on the landscape. And then you have these salt storms rising. Now, I was talking about the element of intersectionality and complexity. What triggered the government of Kazakhstan to actually access some funding, mainly through the World Bank and the Global Environment Facility, was through the health sector. Because the number of women and children affected by the dust from the degraded wetlands, colleagues, when this dust, where pesticides and other chemicals have dried and turned into dust, when you inhale it, it's almost like a nuclear bomb going off in your lungs. It's awful. People get sick and their lifespan is shortened very dramatically. So this demonstration to say the actual health impact to its population is as a result of the change in the ecosystem, in the wetland, the funding comes in. But what has the funding done in response to your question? The government of Kazakhstan has also been able to demonstrate to many sources of funding, as I mentioned, because the sea is returning because of 3 Ramsar sites, our sites, and I can mention 3 wetland sites that mostly women have managed and protected and are restoring. So you begin to see the role of community, the power of community. The same thing we've seen in Iraq, in the Iraqi marshes. The same thing we're seeing in Lake Chad, which is a transboundary Ramsar site, in Cameroon, Nigeria, Chad. And we begin to see the power of indigenous peoples and women when they show the evidence, but also the power of knowledge systems, the indigenous knowledge system and the science, together with earth observations, to really show that this place has changed, but we need to invest in the communities so that this restoration continues. And I just want to add a little bit from His Excellency from Trinidad and Tobago, this aspect of monitoring. You know, when funding comes to these spaces, it's not just a one-off. It's not a one-off issue. This monitoring has to continue, and I think this is why in many of these negotiation processes there's a rethink. Should we be doing these 3-year projects? Do they even make sense? These 3-year projects, they just don't. It should be long-term programs at a landscape level. And I think this is what the UNCCD is also talking about, the G20 initiative, at the very landscape level. How do you invest long term? Because these changes, drought is a slow onset. You almost don't see it coming, it just creeps up on you. What you see is the change in the climatic dynamics or in the hydrological dynamics. Oh, yeah, there's less rain, and last year there was less rain. But by the time it manifests and changes, you are already assaulted and affected. So the financing mechanism is a critical one. And us as a convention, one of the things that we're doing a very extensive analysis of how many of our contracting, those 173 contracting parties or member states, actually have access to GCF, to Global Environment Facility, Adaptation Fund. Uganda got a GCF 30 million program on wetlands, but it's because the government of Uganda insisted. When we talk about wetlands, we're not just talking about restoration and resilience, we're also talking about climate change. If we do lose these wetlands, and thanks with UNDP and UNEP, etc., when we lose these wetlands, we will be affected economically, socially, and environmentally. So these funding streams also have to cut across and really be impactful. So it's an investment for impact.
I love the fact that you brought out this the length of time it takes, because I think one of the things I've always struggled with understanding is why we use a pilot project approach to systemic problems. And across the world, across our organizations, across our governments, you see that continuously. It's a sort of, here's a pilot project. And actually, we were having a very interesting conversation with a group of ecopreneurs yesterday. And their issue is not with creating the pilot. As you all said, the technology exists. Their issue was not with creating the pilot project. It was with scaling, and it was with time. So it's really interesting to see that. All of you legislators have talked about, the fact that we need to create legislation. In some cases, we definitely need to modify archaic legislation. In many cases, we need to create the regulations. And as Beatrice pointed out, we also need to make sure we implement, right? So I'm going to ask you slightly different question this time. I'm going to ask you the question of, imagine yourself as a superhero. Yeah. What would you say is the superpower, the one superpower of legislators?
Persuasion.
Persuasion. Very interesting. Tell us more.
Well, let me put it in context. All right. We are here today preaching to the converted. We're assuming that everyone is on the same page. I don't see it that way at all. That I saw a meme where you saw a family, a group of people in a desolated landscape, and they're huddling around the fire. And one guy says, yes, we destroyed the planet, but for a brief moment, we had excellent shareholder value. I want to tell you, that's a possibility, right? There's a tension in the world. There are two streams. One is unregulated capitalism, and they want profit over people. And the other one is responsibility. We want guardrails to protect the planet, biodiversity, and our future generations. Which voices will the governments listen to? You saw what's happening in the United States. A Trump administration, even though they are aware, are in denial. They're going to put profits first. They're going to enable the fracking. They're going to enable the ocean mining. We can fall into that trap too. So we need to be aware, and we need to whisper into the right voices. And with that, awareness and persuasion.
Persuade beyond the bubble. Okay, I see Beatrice has a superpower.
Influencing. First, I would like to state that we need to work on, together as a world, we need to work on technological innovations that are sustainable and especially focus on the indigenous people and particularly women, because women have been known to be good agents of change worldwide. I say this because women are also affected differently with climate change. But one thing I would feel we should do is that all governments must put as a priority the issue of land restoration in their budgets, in their policies, in their work plans. But above all, the world must also address the issue of climate injustice. Who are the largest contributors to global emissions, and how then are they contributing into addressing the issue of climate change? For example, we know the percentage of global emissions from Africa, but we are mostly affected. I would like the world to attend to the issue of climate injustice. But all governments must prioritize land restorations in their budgets and in their work plans and in all that they do. Because basically, our land is our life. In land we get food, in land we get our clothes, in land we get all the medicine, in land we get everything. So the world must attend to the issues of land.
So you are talking to speak. I guess the superpower you're suggesting is speaking up for those who are not heard.
Yes.
Women, climate justice. Okay, Rosa.
Yeah, I agree with these superpowers, and I will add that something that an old politician told me. He said, Rosa, the politician cannot stand being shamed publicly. So always request a public vote, because nobody in the right mind can be against virtue. So that's the thing, is that you do your case, you present the evidence, you present the case, and you propose a solution. Lots of people will try to make it an in-clause vote, so nobody knows, and so nobody questions about their invested interest, like the affinities they have with certain lobbyists. But in public, they will have to argue and say why they are against these good things that we are being proposing. So I think this is a superpower, because we have the right to ask for a public vote on anything.
Nice. Make it public, make it transparent. Jacqueline, do we have a superpower?
Yes, I believe so. And like my colleagues have mentioned, I think politicians, I don't even think, I know that politicians, especially members of parliaments are strategically positioned. Strategically positioned to influence at all levels. Because when I go to any ministry, I am able to influence. If I bring my issues in the parliament, especially in regards to my areas of interest, and as long as I joined parliament, my areas of interest have been on climate change. That is the space I occupy. Issues of restoration cannot be in isolation. So I think that the superpower is to stand up, be counted, and speak for what you believe in, and make sure that there is change. Because if you just spoke and you don't follow up, then you are as well doing nothing. Following up in terms of, okay, regulations are there, how much allocation? I sit in the budget committee, how much of the money is going to that vote? But then, if the money has gone there, how much of it has been utilized, and into which areas? So I think that is the bottom line. Otherwise, our role is very clear on allocation, legislations, oversight, and yeah. So it's a summary of the strategic positions that members of parliament occupy. And I know in this restoration agenda, the sky should just be the beginning.
And we
Thank
must
you.
lead from the front.
Yeah. Musonda, I want to come back to you. You've been listening to these superpowers. Do you have examples of where it's really worked well, that you've seen this, take place and you've seen a change happen through legislation?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think I spoke a little bit to the issue. I mean, the Uganda story, because of part of the legislative change of the wetland policy in Uganda, they're also combining that with the land tenure policy. Because if somebody buys land in the country, you have to be able to assess, is it or is it not in a wetland area? So they have, the Ministry of Environment is connected with the Ministry of Lands and the same database, etc. So you begin to see how the legislative framework is anchored in there to be able to back, as Her Excellency has said, to enforce that. Same thing is happening in Chile, and Chile is fascinating because when I met Senator Uresti, it was fascinating. He said to me, Musanda, when we talk to the communities about having urban wetlands legislated, the first thing they said back to private sector was, "Are you trying to take away our city? Is somebody trying to take over the?" Because they were afraid. The moment you hear wetlands legislated, who exactly is going to own these spaces? And this is also comes over to the power of storytelling. What does it actually mean? What is your story of your city? What is the story of your island? What is your story of your lake? What is your story of your forest? Why does it matter? And I think this has a massive, massive strategic influence and positioning, and also the aspect of persuasion, because you're giving the story. This is where I was born. It used to look like this. I'm so glad to see all these pictures over here, because some of these pictures, I can tell you in a few years, you're not going to see this. If you have not visited the Pavilion of China, have a moment to look at the Pavilion of China. They have spectacular pictures from over 80 years ago. You can see the before and you can see the after. What exactly happened? There is a story there. Something happened, and it's also connected to legislation.
Thank you, Musonda. The power of storytelling. I'm going to hold on to that. One of the reasons, and this is for the audience here, I want to explain to you how we have this fabulous collection of people together. As I had mentioned when I started, I work for the United Nations System Staff College. And in 2022, I was approached by the G20 Global Land Initiative at the UNCCD. And their question to us was this. They said, look, we recognize, Sandhya, that legislation is essential for land restoration because lands essentially are, under national ownership, and countries need to be able to put in the legislations to make that happen. Now, the most important group of people to make that happen are legislators. And their question was, how do we bring legislators together on this to sort of become agents of change in this space? So that was the challenge that we had. And our solution was actually to put together a program that we call the Global Changemaker Academy for Parliamentarians. It's a face-to-face program that happens every year in Bonn. You see here our star members from the 2023 cohort and from the 2024 cohort. So we've had 2 rounds of it so far. And what we did was we brought 30 members of national parliaments from around the world to Bonn for 5 days, where we had a series of different events and interactions and so on, but we also exposed them to some, cutting edge thinking in the space. And here you see one of our star speakers as well. So that is how I know this amazing, eminent group of people. And what we did during those 5 days in 2023 and 2024 was to try and bring together some of the thinking, but also give them a space to talk to each other. So I actually want to come to each of you to ask you, from that discussion that took place in 2023 for some of you and 2024, what have you been able to take away to implement? What have you been able to actually apply in your contexts?
Okay, thank you so much, Sandhya. And being the first cohort of the GCAP, yes, it was very important for these 5 days to enrich my understanding on global restoration practices and strengthened my commitment to implementing similar strategies in Uganda and in the regional community. Through GCAP, I also learned the value of cross-border collaboration in addressing transboundary environmental challenges. The platform has also provided tools and resources to effectively engage stakeholders and mobilize resources for land restoration initiatives. And from participating in the GCAP, like I said earlier, we have come up with a strong forum in Uganda, Parliament, on land restoration, which is playing a key role in influencing different policy frameworks in the country in that direction. And of course, also at the regional level, like I said earlier, I have a bill, it has reached to the second reading. Hopefully by March next year, we will have an act of the EAC on land restoration in the East African region. That will be across the 9 countries. So that is very important to me. And being a Secretary General of the African Network of Parliamentarians on Climate Change, we are saying that the other regions like the SADC PF, the ECOWAS, and all the other regions, because we have 5 regional economic communities of the African Union, should replicate this as members of parliament. So we are galvanizing the continent. And I know that we will get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you. Well, I have to say it was a real privilege to be part of that UN cohort. It certainly did a lot in terms of heightening my awareness of the seriousness and urgency of the situation. They not only got parliamentarians together, but they organized experts to share information and insight, which we then were able to take back to our respective parliaments. Sometimes you feel pretty much alone when you're advocating for climate change and ecological conservation, when you're in the parliamentary space and with governments. So being around like-minded individuals is a very nurturing thing. So that was very important. And long story short, it fortified my desire to continue this important fight.
Thank you.
I want to thank. I want to start by thanking the G20, the global initiative, for bringing us together then, and for even this engagement. One thing that I learned from that engagement is that communities are critical in the process of land restoration, that we must focus on the communities, that once the communities are engaged, then we will be achieving our main objective. So part of my work is to enhance that community engagement. I also learned that you cannot go on this alone. We need to network and work as a team and work towards regional corporations and even the continental space, because the land is one and we need to work towards that restoration. I have also enhanced my legislative work. And as I told you, I've enhanced the fact that I've become a champion of the SDGs and land in particular. I'm looking forward to more engagements and to call upon everybody that let us save our land. Our land is our future.
Thank you, Beatrice.
Yes, thank you so much. I think this experience was incredibly useful and had lots of benefits to each and all of us. For me specifically is that I saw clearly that we all had seeds of leadership in us, but when we came out, we were sure that we were leaders and that we were going to go back and advocate for the things that we believe in. One important thing that I remember, is that so far, every time I was looking for financement in land restoration or anything on environment restoration, the issue was, but that doesn't bring money. That doesn't bring money. And I remember in this course was the first time where I saw numbers of, for every dollar that is invested in nature, that is invested in land restoration, it can bring back 15, 30, and that's only the direct benefit. The indirect benefit is so much bigger because it holds community, it develops the whole community, and it brings so many co-benefits. So I was sure now of my beliefs. And the personal and the human connection within the network makes it valuable too. Thank you.
It's wonderful to hear. I think this is when the reason that we call the program a Changemaker Academy, and I think we're really seeing change makers here at the on the podium with us. But Masonda, before we finish, I want to come to you with one last question. As a change maker in your own right, what would you see as a successful outcome of this COP? What would you like us to take away from here?
I think the successful outcome is really that we emerge out of this scope with some hope, because the last few weeks have been seemingly very hopeless. People have come from Baku, the plastic treaty, but it's really, I'm seeing hope when I hear from Her Excellency saying that she's put a bill on plastics in her country, regardless of what's emerging in the multilateral space. I really hope that it takes people to make change. And I'm excited about that. And maybe if I can use this opportunity, Sadia, to also invite all of you to Victoria Falls Town next year in July from the 23rd to the 31st. It's the first COP of 2025, and our COP is the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands on the Victoria Falls in Southern Africa. So welcome.
That's wonderful. Mark your diaries, people. All right. Thank you all so very much for being here. I wanted to check if I can ask very quickly if there are a couple of questions from the audience. Oh, I see a number. Okay. If we can pass around, yeah. So I see 1, 2, 3, and 4.
So good morning. I'm really happy, especially that we have the DG of Ramsar here. I'm from Nigeria, and I'm from Yobe State. Yobe State is the home of the Hadeja Unguru wetlands. Hadeja Unguru wetlands is part of the larger Lake Chad basin, and we're having a lot of problems. We have problem with invasive grasses, and when we look at the root causes of that problem, it has to do with a policy problem. The policy problem stems from Kano State. It's more or less like a national state. There is the damming at the upper stream, 2 big dams, and then that actually affected the flow of river downstream. And then poor agricultural practices also. It then affected, actually increased the runoff of fertilizers and other agricultural inputs into the wetlands, and then resulting to eutrophication. This has affected the livelihood of 10 million people. So the issue here is we have legislators, but unfortunately they are aware of the problems, and the solutions to the problems, they are not really aware of it because they lack the technical or wherewithal. Our states, like my big sister here have mentioned, doesn't have the financial capacity to restore those wetlands also. And what I am asking is, would the Ramsar, in their capacity, since the Hadeja Unguru wetland is one of the premier Ramsar sites in Nigeria, what can they do in their capacity to see that they helped Yobe State, Jigawa State, and Kano State to overcome this problem?
Okay. Can I ask that we actually take the 3 questions and then come back to? And can I ask us to stay focused on the question, please?
Thank you very much. My name is Olumide. I'm going to come in another dimension because every development, every decision starts from I call it the Senate, the legislative. But one of the biggest problem I think is happening, and it's direct to the legislative, is to look at what are your barriers when it comes to the issue of political resistance. Because the moment you get back to that table, there's a lot of political resistance. How do you manage that? And what are the funding limitations that you have? Because you mentioned that by next year, March, they are going to be passing a reading. It takes time to actually get to that place. Another one is, what are the conflicts? conflict brew from local governments to the subnationals. How do you manage all this? Because by the time you want to raise an initiative through the legislative, all these kind of people need to be carried along. And my last question is about data. Because before you influence a readings or you influence a legislation, there's need for a sort of decision making and a sort of data that can influence that action. How do you manage all these things? Thank you.
Okay. One more question here, and then.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for this panel. I'm Dunya Khouri from Lebanon, but I just want to add something to focus on one issue that is, I think it's very important for the restoration of the land, and which is the woman's right to the land. So if we can have all one issue that you are focusing on, women's right to the land. When the women have the right to the land, they can restore it, they can plant, they can have their food security, the security of their family. So let's have all together this keynote, women's right to the land. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to let Musonda come in first, I think, to answer the first question, and then I move it to you.
Okay, I'm actually going to pull a thread through all the three questions because they're very much interrelated. Women, in March of this year, we did, for the first time in the convention's history, if you go on our website, ramza.org, look out for the 12 women that we had there as women and wetland change makers. One of them is Cecile Njebet. She was here. She just left yesterday. She's from Cameroon and set up an organization called Rekakof. Rekakof is an organization that looks at the restoration of land and the role of land tenure across Africa for women. Many women, not just in Africa and many other parts of the world, cannot be involved in restoration when they do not own the land. If it belongs to your husband, you're like, you go there with your project and say, plant 20 million trees or 30, etc. And they'll be like, what if I have to leave? I cannot invest here. This is a very pivotal question, and it comes to the Lake Chad. The Lake Chad is one of the most complex landscape systems where the transboundary communities, the transhumance communities, the resident communities, and just speaking to one aspect of Lake Chad and really in responding to your question, us as a convention, we are a multilateral treaty. Your government has joined our convention and allocated and dedicated that wetland as a Ramsar site. Now, the role of the community also matters. And this is why I talked about storytelling. Visualization of the change. The fact that something else upstream is happening in the terms of a dam changes the hydrological system of the wetland. We have 6 international organization partners working on the ground. We don't do projects as a convention. However, our partners do. Wetlands International, IUCN, the World Conservation Union, BirdLife International, WWF, many others, including local civil society group. There is power in partnership, working with communities to amplify, together with local leaders and legislators, to say, what can we do together? Because if this changes, you're doomed. We have seen what has happened with migratory pathways just from the Lake Chad and in the Sahel, going all the way to the Mediterranean. This is problematic. Data. Olumide, you ask about the issue of data. Us as a convention, we are encouraging all countries to have national wetland inventories. You cannot save what you don't know. Even if you go to the Jeff, you go to any funding mechanism, they'll be like, how many birds are here? What is the acreage of this wetland? What is it? Is it perennial? Is it seasonal? What is the volume of water? What are the livelihood issues? Is there an endemic fish that people are dependent? All of this data matters for decision making and also for investment so that the change can happen.
Can I ask quickly from Beatrice, how do you manage political pressure?
I wanted to attend to a question. The issue of land tenure continues to really bring problems, and especially to women. But in Kenya, we have the Land Act 2012 that addresses the issue of the management of land, the administration of land, and land use programs. And then coming to his question about conflicts, how to handle conflicts between national and subnational governments. In Kenya, we have 2 levels of government with distinct functions as unbundled in the Constitution. And the functions are very clear. But where there's a conflict, the national act or the national policy overtakes the county functions. So there are also intergovernmental forums for thrashing out any conflicts. We do not foresee any conflicts because the functions are very clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I am going to, I see that we are actually on time. So I'm afraid I can't take any more questions, but I would like the opportunity for each of you to have a one sentence response to the question you've had or what you would like to leave as a final message. So Anthony, could I go to you?
Right. So to answer your question, let me start by saying, as an independent senator, I'm not subject to any party whip, so I can speak my mind. It's a different dynamic to being in opposition or government. As an independent senator, I try not to alienate the decision makers in government. So the idea is to guide and persuade. And I do that using a mix of hard and soft skills. So hard might be for calling for a land use plan, oversight committees, calling for accountability. Soft might be to bring petitions in the parliament with an ecological nature, and of course, by raising awareness in the public space. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
One sentence, Jacqueline.
Thank you, Olamido. I just wanted to ask you to answer your question on pressure, but also on the bills. So in our parliamentary proceedings, we can bring bills as private members, as members of parliament, but also some bills can be brought by the government or by the ministers. So when, like, there's two bills that are brought on single-use plastic is private members bill, and also land restoration for the region is private members bill. So what I do, the law allows me to partner with other stakeholders who are working in the same area to sponsor this bill. Once this bill has reached the third stage, and of course there is a lot of consultation that is done. For example, in Uganda, I'm particularly assigned to deal with regional issues in the East African Parliament. So we do consultations in all the 9 countries. Before that bill comes to be enacted as an act of parliament, there must be consensus and an agreement. So it's widely consulted, and where there are disagreements, you agree to disagree or agree, but you move on with the right thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lastly, I call on all of us to be change makers. Be the change that you are talking about. Be the change that you require to see. Land is about our lives. Let us protect and restore our land.
Thank you, Beatrice. Rosa.
Yes, just to thank you for being interested in this subject. And please go back and knock the doors of your local politicians and say, this is what I heard and this is what we demand as a change. Thank you.
Wonderful. Engage with your local parliamentarians. Musonda?
Be the change you want to see.
Thank you all so very much for being with us. And I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as we did. Thank you.